Good morning, Teresa. Thank you so much for joining us. For all you listeners here, this is a conversation that I've been really looking forward to for a while now. Teresa and I first met maybe a year ago, and we connected and chatted briefly on the topic of emotional intelligence. And this is something I've been passionate about for a long time, and I consider myself fairly educated on. But even for me, the conversation we had was hugely eye-opening. So once I got started with this video confidence channel, and I realized that a lot of the things that are holding people back have to do with their emotional intelligence. I knew right away that I wanted to have Teresa on the show, and now it's just getting to happen. So Teresa is a emotional intelligence coach and speaker, and I'm actually going to start off just by having you, Teresa, explain just for people who aren't familiar with the term exactly what is emotional intelligence.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to speak to your audience as well. It's probably the number one question that is asked about the topic, like, what exactly is it? And it can, in a nutshell, be very easy to understand it conceptually. It's really understanding our emotional information, where it comes from, how it was triggered, what it feels like in our bodies, and then being able to use that emotional information, first regulating it so it doesn't drive our behavior, and second, to use it to strengthen relationships, solve problems, collaborate with other people, manage our stress, feel like we're living a really strong and fulfilling life. And, in that nutshell, emotional intelligence is often way more important than our IQ, because when we rub people the wrong way with our behaviors, no one wants to stick around to see how smart we are. And so these skills are really important, especially within the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that in the world of using video, right, or really honestly, it's doing anything that's new, intimidating, and involves you being vulnerable and open, right? But in the context of the show, it's video. I think there's a lot of those, emotional and understanding regulation skills that really come into play. And for people who lack those skills, it can be a huge barrier. And for people who have those skills, it can be the key to making progress and moving forward and overcoming that discomfort.
Mhm.
So what I'm planning with this interview is I would love to hear from you. What are some of the key emotional intelligence skills that are related to being confident on camera and doing things that scare you? And then once we know what they are, I mean, what can we actually do to grow those skills? So what would be the first thing you'd bring up for a skill involved, emotional intelligence skill involved in doing something new and scary, such as getting comfortable on camera?
The foundational one of the foundational skills for emotional intelligence is emotional self-awareness. So really that is understanding, like, what emotion I am experiencing right now and why am I experiencing it. And oftentimes in the exploration of our emotional self-awareness, that's driving us pretty deep into our life, how we were raised, things we experienced as a kid, messaging we've been sort of exposed to for our entire life, and all of these things. So, everything within our past, our relational diaries, our emotional diaries, all of our experiences meet us in the present if they're unresolved. And something like positioning yourself in front of a camera to expose yourself to perhaps a very broad audience can really highlight a lot of those past emotional experiences, sometimes within an instant. And so we have these sort of really broad spectrum emotions that can be experienced, and sometimes we don't even know why we're experiencing them. And so it can be quite frustrating if our emotional self-awareness skills are very low, that capacity to be aware, to pick up on the pebble of an emotion that's beginning. We first start to feel it physically within our body. Like, for example, if I'm anxious, I might get sweaty palms. But before my palms get sweaty, perhaps what I notice is I start to have difficulty swallowing. And the difficulty swallowing is really subtle, but the sweaty palms is something that I definitely notice. So instead of me noticing the really subtle nuance of that emotion of the difficulty swallowing, I'm escalating the emotion to the palm sweating. And perhaps when I get to that point, now my emotion's really driving my behavior. So my voice starts to get shaky and I start to sweat, and then I lose my words and I can't think. Because when our emotions start to drive the bus of our behaviors, our IQ is almost inaccessible. We can't access that prefrontal cortex of our brain where all of our rational, logical IQ thinking happens. And so then we find that we're a little bit of a train wreck.
So a lot of people, when they start doing video content or video email communication or something like that, they describe this, I don't know, this phenomenon, we'll say, where they know what they want to say. It's a pretty
Mhm.
clear thing to say, pretty straight, pretty direct. They press play, they look into the camera, and they figure what they have to say as soon as they look into the camera lens. Is that part of what's going on there, where the emotion rises up and kind of cuts off the brain's activity in the frontal cortex where you form thoughts?
Yeah, that's pretty much what happens right there. And that whole process can happen very quickly, as you just described it. And it can also be interrupted by so many different thoughts that float through that person's mind that are triggered by the emotion that they're experiencing, sorry. And so, we think about when we've encountered anything where we sort of get emotionally triggered, and it doesn't even matter the emotion that we're triggered into. It could be fear or anger, it could be disgust, surprise, happiness, sadness, even. When we have that emotional rising, we can all remember a time when that emotional experience forced us into behaving in ways that were even sort of really uncommon or uncharacteristic to us. We may have noticed ourselves thinking, what's going on right now? And then that whole thought process that precedes that amplifies the emotional experience, because our thoughts go sometimes towards the negative and damaging, as opposed to thinking abundantly and positively to regulate the emotion. We tend to have our thoughts drive towards scarcity and negativity, and those thoughts amplify the emotional experience. So if we wanted to be able to harness the power of the emotions we're experiencing and regulate better, one of the things to be able to do is, number one, start watching yourself like a hawk. Pay attention to what does neutral feel like to you? And then what is the subtle difference for you between neutral and an emotional experience? And pay attention to the signals that your body gives you. And this is an exercise you could do like on the hour, every hour, is just stop for 30 seconds, scan your body, and write it down. So right beside your desk, you could have a notebook that's just like my emotional journal. And every hour on the hour, you stop, scan your body, you're like, turns out I have like a tension across my chest. So I write down tension across my chest. What else is going on? Mouth is dry, dry mouth. And if you don't notice any other signals, you then pause and think, what emotion am I experiencing right now? And then you write the emotion that you are experiencing, you name it. This practice forces our noticing muscles. It's forcing us to pay attention to our physical signals, which are always associated to some sort of an emotion. And we start to see the pattern. When we name the emotion, we start to see the pattern in the physical experiences. And what we're doing is we're increasing our emotional self-awareness.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Now, at the beginning of this answer that you just gave, you mentioned, that foundational skill is noticing what you're feeling and understanding why you're feeling it. So we just talked about noticing what you're feeling, right? The exercise of observing the body, which is really interesting, by the way. I never would have expected the body to be the first place you check. I knew it was involved, but interesting. Sorry, got distracted there. So the why side of it, um, that's interesting. Because I think you're right. There's a lot of people who will feel something and not really be sure why they're feeling it. In fact, I'll even notice last week I was really in a bit of a funk the whole week, and I really had no idea, and I still don't know why I was. So, what guidance can you give us on when you start to feel this tension, this anxiety? How do you figure
Mm-hmm.
out why if it's not readily apparent to you?
Yes, it takes time, because there's very little training that we've received in the art of staying with our emotional experiences and allowing ourselves to be in often what is a state of discomfort. So, d- a lot of times we could be in the habit of really labeling our emotions as good ones and bad ones. And because we label them like that, we want to stay in the good ones, we want to get away from the bad ones. And if we remove that label, what that allows us to do is, when we're experiencing an emotion, is to treat it as simply data. It's information. Yes, it's emotional information, so we do physically feel it. And if we allow ourselves the time to stay with that emotion and simply be interested in it, then we can start to explore a sort of 360 view of the emotion, asking questions like, when did this start for me? Oh, it started earlier this morning. Well, what happened just before it started? And if I keep like a record of a calendar or something, I could look at what happened before, or I could just think about what happened before. What's coming up later today? Maybe I'm subconsciously thinking about what's coming up later, and I'm emotionally experiencing that because our subconscious, which is like 95% of our brain activity, is thinking about the past and it's thinking about the future. And so our current emotional experiences may have nothing to do with the present moment, but they may have to do with our past and future subconscious thinking instead. And so there's great power in allowing ourselves permission to be curious about our emotions and ask ourselves those questions: the what, why, how, when, who, where. And the more we do that, the more we improve our self awareness, not just our emotional self awareness, but our self awareness. Oh, I know why this is showing up for me. It always shows up when I'm in this situation, because this situation reminds me of something that happened when I was 12. And because it's not resolved, it keeps showing up in moments like this. Now that I'm aware of it, I can be proactive to it, and I'm paying attention. So instead of me letting the emotion rise to then drive the bus, I feel it and I go, oh, there's that thing again. I know what to do. If I take 5 deep breaths in and out, it allows me to relax. I have a knowing of where it comes from. So I know it's not about the present moment, which means I can regulate the emotion and I can stay present with my IQ turned on.
Now, one thing I've noticed for myself when I am either experiencing emotion and I don't know why, or even if I do know why, if I'm just experiencing a strong emotion, um,
Mhm.
one of the ways I can get back control of the bus, so to speak, um, I don't know exactly how to describe it, but I'm able to pull myself out of the situation and out of myself and almost hover above myself, looking down on the situation and kind of interpret what I'm seeing as a third party observer. Is that a good technique of how to handle strong emotions? And then how do you throw yourself into that state where you're the outside observer looking in instead of being in the middle of the storm?
Yes. So in EQ, that's the skill of reality testing. So becoming the observer. Reality testing is being able to objectively look at what's happening when we're emotional. And so if we think about this technique of floating above yourself for a moment and looking at the situation like an observer would, not in it, then you afford yourself the opportunity to remain objective. And objectivity is an IQ related skill set. It is an EQ skill, but it requires your IQ to be present. And so that objectivity removes personal biases. Anytime we're involved in anything, we have all of our personal biases related to it. Of course, we look through the lens of our own experience. That is what it is to be a human being. And so we will see really good things through that lens, and we will see judgments and assumptions and biases through that lens as well. And we have to be aware that that is what's happening. So when we're aware, we would know when our objectivity is being compromised by a perhaps narrow perspective, and when we need to pan out and consider the perspective from the other person being involved, which is a little bit of reality testing, but it's also empathy. Consider from the perspective of, if someone was to listen, what would they think of this conversation? Consider the perspective of someone who's not even in the room, like a friend, a family member, a peer. If they were here, what would they do in this situation? What would they think of what was going on? And all of a sudden, we start to broaden our perspective. And that reality testing helps us to be much more, not just objective, but much more like fair about the situation, as opposed to influenced by our biases.
Reality testing. It's interesting.
Yes.
Can you
Because
give
when
us
you
a,
talk about something like being in front of a camera and going, I'm not good looking enough, I'm not eloquent enough, who am I to have something to want to say? Sometimes it reminds me a little bit of when you watch singing shows and people come up and they're so confident, they're so passionate, they're so excited, and then they start singing, you're like, ooh. And everybody knows that they're not a good singer except them. And it just seems like, how do they not hear themselves? And so, reality testing for them would be a low level EQ skill because they're incapable of being objective, Perhaps because the emotional driver behind passion and interest in this thing is outweighing and outriding their ability to be objective with it. And so they can't even believe when people tell them that they aren't talented or aren't capable.
It's interesting. And I imagine the reverse can happen too, right? You cannot believe people when they tell you you're talented because
That's right.
emotionally you feel like you're not
That's
enough.
right.
Huh. So reality testing. Um, in my mind, that is a freaking hugely, immensely, phenomenally important skill to be able to pull out
Mhm.
of the situation, look at it objectively, ask yourself the question, all right, I feel this, but what are the biases? What are the emotional triggers that are leading to me feeling that might not quite be grounded in reality? And then again, switch focus to the other person and say, okay, they're feeling this. Why are they feeling this?
Mhm.
And now that we're talking about it, I can picture a lot of people in my life who do not have that skill at all, or in very
Yes.
small amounts.
Yes.
Um, I guess, how do you grow that skill over time? If you have a good answer for that question, I know it's difficult. And then when you're in the moment, right? How do
Mhm.
you flip a switch, pull out, and view the scene as a dispassionate observer in the moment?
Those are both great questions because emotional intelligence skills first garner some speed and momentum by practicing them outside of situations.
Hmm.
And we practice them in reflection in very purposeful exercises related to emotional intelligence. So, one of them is the ABCDE exercise. And basically, anyone can do this because it's not that it's an easy exercise to do. It's not simple to dive into, and it will expand our emotional self-awareness, and it will expand our capacities in problem solving, which is another really important skill, and it will heighten our objectivity or reality testing. So at the end of every day, you can spend 10 to 15 minutes in reflection on one emotional event you had that day. And usually you decide what that event might be because it's still lingering with you. You perhaps are still thinking about it. You have the conversation over and over in your head. You might regret what you did and said already, and you're wrestling with it. The first thing you think about under A is, what was the activating event? What triggered your emotional response? And get really sort of granular and clear on the specifics of what happened. Did someone say something? Did someone do something? Was it something that you saw? Like, was it from internal or was it from external? A combination of two things, perhaps. And then you go to the B column, which is our belief pattern. So when that happened, what were all of the thoughts that ran through your mind? And this can be very difficult for people to recall because oftentimes we're not even paying attention to that narrative. Once you capture as much of those beliefs and thoughts that went through your mind, then you're looking at okay, so what was the consequence? How did I behave? Based on these two things, what did I do? We have to be very accurate in going, I raised my voice, I rolled my eyes, I sighed out loud, like remember everything that we did. And then we have to debate, dispute, and discard. This is the D column. So we have to look back at the B column, which was all of our beliefs, and we have to debate, where's the proof that what I thought was actually true? Is it only true from my perspective? Would it be true from their perspective? Because it doesn't hold weight if it isn't a 360 truth. And we debate each one of them. And then as we debate them, we discard them. And there might only be one or two beliefs left behind. There might be none left behind. And so now, based on what's in the belief column that's left over, what would my emotional reaction be now? And 10 times out of 10, it's different than the initial consequence.
Yeah.
And so here, that debate, dispute, discard, that's the important piece, is we are challenging the programming and belief assumptions, judgments that show up when we are triggered. First, we learn what our triggers are. Then we learn the beliefs that amplify that for a certain emotional experience. So we're working on the reprogramming, we're working on the awareness, and we are testing our own reality by objectively looking at it when we're separate from the emotional experience. Because trying to do it in it when we're not emotionally intelligent yet is very difficult to do.
Hmm.
So this affords us opportunities to be able to look at it and go, I would have behaved differently. And now we're armed with how to behave differently next time. So when I find myself in it next time, in all likelihood, I'm not going to catch myself at the beginning. I'm going to follow my pattern that I've been used to following for 20, 30, 40 years, depending upon how old you are. And what will happen is throughout that pattern, at some point, I'll go, wait a minute, I did this exercise a few weeks ago on something almost just like this. I'm just going to stop for a minute and I'm going to course correct. I'm going to challenge that belief that's floating in my mind that I'm responding to right now. And I'm going to discard it. What if that's not even true? And all of a sudden you emotionally regulate. And you might physically notice yourself like stand up straighter or shake your head or take a deep breath in or out or say something out loud like, wait a minute, that's not actually what I meant. And so we learn to course correct in the moment. And then as our emotional intelligence grows, we catch ourselves before it's happening. We feel it start and we regulate. So we don't say it or we don't do it. And then even before that, we are looking in our daily calendar and we're going, oh, there's a moment that usually triggers me and I'm going to be proactive for it. So in the moment, I'm not even triggered. And that's how we grow our emotional intelligence. It is by practice, by reflection, by course correcting, repeat.
Interesting. So, at first you can really only do this effectively in retrospect, looking back.
Yeah.
Eventually you get to the point where you're able to do it a little bit more in the moment, and you even start to learn your patterns well enough you can do it, proactively, where again, you look forward and say, okay, I'm going to be doing a Zoom meeting room in front of 20 people today, and I know what I'm going to be feeling, what I'm going to be saying. And you can, I guess, pre-select alternative self-talk to run when you start feeling those bad self-talk tracks running. You'll already know what the replacement is.
Yeah, that's why problem solving is part of this equation as an emotional intelligence skill, because when you figure it out, you're like, oh, that's what's happening. I didn't see that before. That's really interesting. Then we have to go like, what am I going to do about it? Because it just doesn't go away. So we need some creative problem solving. We need some solutions to help us through those moments. Breathing, mindfulness exercises, those things help us certainly in every moment, but we may need more than that. We may need things like visual cues. So if I'm presenting on a Zoom meeting to a group of 25 people and I need a visual cue of confidence, I may decide to put a sticky note up that no one else can see except for me. And it's a visual reminder of, you got this, whatever kind of pep talk you need in that moment that will last you. And those kinds of things work. And then sometimes they lose their steam. And so we're constantly changing and adapting strategies as our emotional intelligence grows, because we're going to need to do that to continue its growth pattern, to continue to be better.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Something I want your perspective on here. So I read a book, I think it was last year, called Mind Hacking Happiness by a guy named Sean Webb. Phenomenal book. Highly recommend it to anybody. But one of the things he talks about is when you're in that moment where you're in the middle of the emotional storm and you want to pull out and look at it as an objective observer, but you're having a hard time doing it. One simple little sentence he taught, which can help with that, is label what you're going through, but don't say I this or I that. Use the phrase the me. So you walk into your room, you see your freshly cleaned daughter's, or your daughter's bedroom that was freshly cleaned is now a complete freaking mess. And the phrase you say to yourself is, the me is very angry. The me spent a lot of time cleaning that room, and the me expected that room to stay clean, and the me is upset, right? Using that type of language, or in the case of video, right? The me is feeling anxious. The me doesn't feel like they have anything interesting to say. The me doesn't like being on camera. And that simple phrase can allow you to honor and identify what's happening, but still put just enough distance in there for you to, again, pull into that outside view. What's your thought on that technique? That's too simple, or do you think it would work?
There's great power in the words that we use. And being able to acknowledge something makes it very real, but also brings our awareness to it. I do believe the language that people choose to use in those moments of this technique needs to be supremely positive language, meaning that they can take action and they're empowered to manage it, as opposed to if I use language around scarcity and negativity in those sentences, it's not going to help my emotional state. So I can acknowledge I'm experiencing anger right now. I'm experiencing anger is different than I am angry. So the me is experiencing or the me is angry to me sounds the same as I am angry. It's still labeling me as the emotion as opposed to I'm experiencing an emotion. It's just data. It's so I'm acknowledging that, yeah, I'm experiencing that right now. It's a choice for me to experience it because I have an expectation that it was to be kept clean. What's the possibility that they were not able to meet that expectation? There's a little bit of a possibility there. And so all of a sudden, I'm acknowledging that I've set up an expectation that allowed me to experience anger. I'm in control of the whole thing. I'm the coder and programmer of everything that goes on in here, which means I can change the programming and coding if I would like to, which will shift the emotional experience. So oftentimes, even something more simple than that is when you hear the messaging, you just go cancel, delete, because I know it's not true. And that comes from all of that work outside of emotional events. That we spend time being able to go, no, I know when that stuff, when that narrative shows up and it totally derails me. It's not part of my value system. It's not part of my belief system. It's legacy hardware and software. It's even DNA passed on. It's got nothing to do with me. It's just in there. And so I think it's really important for us to have, like you said, some punchy, impactful, effective things that work when we catch it happening that just completely shuts it down. Now, we won't have that for every emotional experience because sometimes a core value of ours is in conflict. And we're not just going to cancel, delete our core values. Those we stand up for, those we defend, and those we defend in a way that's non destructive and non offensive to the people around us. But, you know, sometimes we have emotional experiences where we're just like, I'm having an emotional experience that I don't even need to be having right now. And those are the ones that we need to really regulate because those are generally the ones that we fly off the rails for. We lose our control over.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Like, that is just another level of cognition where you can take what's coming to you in the form of thoughts, emotions, opinions, and run it through one more filter and say, do I actually want this or not? I think a lot of people, when they assume, when they think it, they assume they should keep it. They assume it must be true. When they believe it, when they feel it, they say, okay, well, this is what I believe, what I feel. I should stick with this. But it's interesting.
Mhm.
There's one more filter you can pass it through and say, okay, well, I believe this. But do I really believe me? You know, like, should I really take this seriously?
Yes.
I think somebody used the expression one time that I liked called, what was it? You don't have to believe everything you think, right? And similarly, you don't have to believe everything you feel. And you actually have the choice to kind of like going through a, a cart of apples and picking the good ones and leaving the bad ones. You can actually again observe all this data coming your way of what you're feeling, what you're thinking, what your beliefs are, and kind of sort through it and say, okay, well, that's a good one, I'm going to hang on to this one, yeah, I know where that's coming from, this is a bit skewed, let's leave that one. And it's just interesting, like that's possible. First of all, how cool is it that that's possible? um,
Yes.
but then how difficult must life be if you can't do that, if you just have to take whatever comes your way from your thoughts and your emotions? Like, whew, a lot of shit that comes our way from our thoughts and emotions that really we don't want.
Yes, very true. There's a lot of it. All of us have been through that. I mean, I don't know. I don't really know if it's possible that there's a human being on the earth that hasn't had those kinds of experiences, which means we can relate when people are having those experiences. We can have empathy, which is understanding someone else's experience. It doesn't mean we agree with it, and it doesn't mean we're going to cheerlead it, but we can understand it. And so this, I think, is one of the best parts of humanity is our capacity to understand other people if we're willing to do so. And that in and of itself, that's social awareness and relationship management, can be quite influential to, if you're developing your EQ, can be quite influential to helping other people in theirs. Because we can't force people to shift their emotional experience, but we can certainly influence by maintaining our calm and our centeredness and choosing to do empathy and listen and create space for people to speak, and then asking a question that helps them to kind of look at it and go, oh, wait a minute, and get their own emotional awareness to elevate.
Yeah. All right, so we've talked a lot here. I think we've covered two EQ skills, right? One is kind of the ability to, notice, observe, and interpret your emotions. The other is that reality checking. No, what was that?
Yeah, reality testing,
Reality
great.
testing. There we go.
Mhm.
So what's next? An EQ skill you can develop to help you get more confident on
Well, we
camera.
also spoke about like the problem solving. Problem solving
Okay.
is another EQ skill, and really is our capacity, because it's in the decision making realm. So once we do that reality testing piece of the ABCDE, and we're like, new emotion, so how would I have responded? This is how I would have responded. So what do I need to now do in those situations to be better? And that's the problem solving skill set of, I'm going to put a sticky note that reminds me that I have skills and I have talents and I can do this, and whatever else that I need. And that problem solving is understanding how our emotions impact our decision making and being able to find creative solutions to that. So then the fourth element would be our self-regard, which is our inner feelings of strength and esteem, often associated with confidence. It's knowing our strengths and our weaknesses and accepting those two things, not being ashamed of them, not blaming ourselves for not having a particular talent.
So let's try this out. I want to linger on the problem solving just a bit longer.
Yeah.
Um, so let me run you a scenario by you, right? I am a person who wants to do more video content, right, for my LinkedIn page to grow my personal brand. But there's two things that I find very problematic. First off, when I record a video of myself, I get stuck in this re-recording trap because it's just not right, so I got to re-record it. And then I make a new mistake, so I got to re-record it. I make a new mistake, so I got to re-record it. And I end up re-recording the same video 12 times. Um, before I finally, have something I'm happy with. And I don't like that pattern. I would much rather do one or two takes and be done with it, because the fact that it takes half an hour to an hour to do these recordings means I just don't get it done as often. So I want to hear, some suggestions you have on like problem solving for that. The other thing too is every time I post a video on LinkedIn, I just get like washed over by this wave of shame and embarrassment and feeling like it's not good enough and people are judging me for that video and I should take that video down, and like a really negative posting experience, right? Which again makes it less likely that I'll post a video in the future because it was such a negative experience when I posted the video last time. Assuming I'm understanding problem solving right, you should be able to anticipate, when you wake up that morning and know you have posted video in your calendar, you should be able to anticipate that those things are going to happen, and
Mhm.
then use problem solving skills to be able to minimize those events.
Yes. One of the things that I'm going to step us back like 12 steps
All right.
right into purpose. So if I wake up in the morning and I am living in service to my dream or my purpose, then anything that I have to do that is part of that is something that I will have passion around, talent around, the world will need, and maybe I can also get paid for.
Okay.
And so purpose lives at the center of those four things. If I am doing anything in my day that does not live in one of those four quadrants, then in all likelihood, my emotional information will tell me that. And it'll be signaling me, stop doing this. But I may have belief patterns about what I should be doing, what I'm expected to be doing, that are counter to that emotional information that is really our wisdom and intuition speaking to us in ways that we might not be aware of because we haven't been trained on how to pay attention to our emotional information. So we are emotional beings with the capacity to think, not thinking beings with the capacity to feel. So our emotional information is older and wiser than our logical information. So that in and of itself can be a struggle for some people who are having emotional experiences around the day in and day out work of what they're doing. Perhaps that's a signal that this is not the work. So
Interesting.
I just want to put that out there as one of them. Now, if they're like, this is the work, I'm meeting the four criteria, and then I step in to do the work, and part of my personality is like perfectionism. I need to get things just right before I'm willing to put it up. And so take after take after take after take, and I get frustrated because, I can't get it perfect. And part of my personality is perfectionism. We have to have a deep understanding of our own personality traits, how they show up and help us and how they show up and hinder us. So perfectionism is a personality trait that definitely has benefits to it, but it definitely has things that are not good about it. And we have to be aware when it shows up, and our emotions will signal us and say, oh, there's that personality trait of yours showing up. Problem solving, what do I want to do about it to help myself be more successful in this moment? Maybe I need to take shots that are shorter in nature because I can do 10-second clips that are perfect. But if I try to do 30-second clips, I make two mistakes along the way and then I start all over again. We learn to adjust creative problem solving, how we work. Perhaps I know I am most articulate between 11 and 12:30. And so that's when I film. I don't try to do it first thing in the morning, and I definitely don't do it at 3 o'clock when I'm ready to take a nap. Like I pick the when part of the day when I'm at my best to do the things that require my most amount of onness and creativity and expression and everything else that you're looking for in an online video. I don't know many directors of movies that don't do take after take after take after take after take anyways, because they're not looking for perfection. They're looking for the best representation of the material. And so when we are watching ourselves back and we are listening to ourselves, what is the best representation of material is always when we are our most authentic. And I don't know anyone who doesn't speak and fumble, like in real life. So why am I setting an expectation that when I put out video content, that when I speak, I wouldn't fumble? Like that's authentic. And part of that is because when we watch other people's video content, we're sometimes looking at their highlight reel. We're looking at the perfect one. We're not looking at the one where they've, made 20 takes of it. We only see the one that they finish and put up. So it's this odd comparison we get ourselves into, in that we think everyone else is perfect and I suck at this. No, everyone's doing the exact same thing that you're doing. Give yourself a little bit of a break and know that this is part of the process when you're producing video content. If you want it to be perfect, you're going to have to take multiple takes. If you want it to be authentic, you might be able to do it in one.
Yeah. Cool.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, last skill set there you mentioned was self-regard. So talk a little bit more about what that is.
So knowing our strengths and our weaknesses and accepting what those things are. So when we understand our talents to our greatest degree, and our talents for me, I'm defining as natural talents, capacities we are born with. It's just part of who we are. And we all know things like that. From a very young age, we were probably good at some things and other things we're train wreck at. We aren't. And that's a good way to go, like strength, weakness. And sometimes we may have been raised in an environment where weaknesses were not allowed. And remember, how we were raised greatly impacts how things show up for us right now. And so confidence and esteem, if we were raised in an environment where mistakes were not allowed, less than 100% was not allowed, stakes were always high, you always needed to be the top. If we were raised in that environment, then we have to know that things like shame and blame and embarrassment, when things aren't perfect, those things are going to show up, because that's our emotional experience driven by a particular belief pattern from when we were raised. And we can break that pattern. It takes work to do it, for sure, but we can break it. And it's just the consistency of re-messaging, reprogramming, changing the belief pattern. So self-regard is really about, and a little bit of reality testing, objectively looking at what are my talents. Marianne Williamson has this great poem, Our Deepest Fear. And for anyone listening, go Google it and read it, and it will tell you exactly why self-regard is so important. Because when we live in the fullness of our talents, then we shine really bright. And people like being around other people like that, but it also gives permission for other people to do the same. And so collectively as a human race, we start to rise each other or elevate each other up. And this elevates, this action in and of itself is reciprocal. It elevates our self-regard. And so we're feeding into it and we're getting a byproduct of it. And this is a cycle that I just think, why wouldn't we want to do this?
The traditional term we're all raised hearing about is self-esteem, and that almost feels like self-esteem is about believing that you're good, believing that you're great, believing that you're awesome. Self-regard, as you're talking about, is maybe a little bit less of that, a little bit more just an open, unbiased, unemotional awareness of here's what I'm good at, here's what I'm bad at, and not even necessarily placing value judgments on am I a good person, am I a bad person, just simple and openness to what your strengths and weaknesses are. Is that a good distinction between those two terms?
Yes, very good distinction, because the word acceptance is in the definition of self-regard. We have to accept it. And when we accept both of them, we're non-judgmental of them. They just are.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um, any advice on how to get to that point? Because again, the way I see self-regard is you're able to own what you're good at without necessarily embarrassment, about saying you're good at it, right? Be comfortable saying, yes, I'm good at this. Um, but then the more difficult part is to be able to look at an area that you're weak at, and again, without a lot of emotions or shame coming in the equation, say, this is something I struggle at. Any advice on how to gain that skill? Because I think for most people, looking at a weakness of theirs and saying it's a weakness causes a shame reaction, causes some negative emotional reaction. How do you get to the point where that doesn't happen?
Well, you watch the emotional trigger. So you watch the emotional information and explore where is that coming from. So, the why, what, when, where, how information, and acknowledging it helps. The supporter of self-regard is reality testing once again. So it's being able to be objective, and we can't be objective if we're emotional. So we have to regulate the emotion, understand it first, and then we can look at things objectively and move towards well, what do I want to do about it? So if this is a weakness area to me, is it derailing me the achievement of my dream? Is it derailing me in my workplace, in my family? Like, is it derailing me? No. Well, then why am I worried about it? So just drop it. Not necessary. You know what? This weakness gets in my way at work. It actually prevents me from doing a good job in a key component of what I'm responsible for. All right. So what would you like to do about that? I'm going to have to take a course. Excellent. Take a course. Close the gap on that weakness. Things that we're weak at that we know we want to develop, there are so many ways to go about doing that. You can get a mentor, you can get a coach, you can take a course, you can read a book, you can willingly enter into the learning loop of observation feedback. So someone watches you and gives you feedback, and you go introspective. What did I learn? And then you try, and then you fail, and you get feedback again, and you just continue this loop until you don't fail anymore. You go, oh, success, excellent. And you're closing the gap on that weakness. So, to your point, emotional intelligence is not this thing where we just like grab one skill and we run with it. Although if people out there are like, where do I start? Hands down, emotional self-awareness. That's where we start for most people. There are a few people in the population who need to start with stress management first because they're so stressed out. They're actually incapable of even being aware of their emotional experiences because they're flat out in reaction mode. Their amygdala is just firing on all cylinders, and they're just in fight, flight, or freeze mode. So they're not even getting to the emotional experiences yet. For the rest of us, EQ is 5 realms and 15 skills in this model that is like a big 3-dimensional circle. And so we want to think about it like a spider web lives in that circle. And these EQ skills all play together. We have to seek balance between them. So when we think about self-regard, like knowing my strengths and weaknesses, we also have to think about reality testing. We have to be objective about what that is. And then we also have to think about interpersonal relationships. And so how am I responding with other people? And we have to think about our emotional self-awareness and what's the influence of that. We have to think about all the skills working together like a grand puzzle. And the more balanced we are in our skill development across these 15 scales, the more emotionally intelligent we are. The less balanced we are, the more we'll find that in some situations we're emotionally rock solid. And in other situations, we fly off the rails and we're really inconsistent in how we behave. People much more prefer consistent behavior, even if it's terrible, than they do inconsistent behavior. Because consistent, I can trust, even when it's bad, because I know what I'm going to get. But inconsistent, I can't trust because I don't know if I'm going to get Teresa who is kind and caring and patient, or I'm going to get Teresa who flies off the rails.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for this, Teresa. I have learned a lot. And again, I consider myself fairly well versed in this topic, but you've exposed new things to me. And again, I really did love tying it together to the world of video because making yourself vulnerable, putting out video content, video communication is such an emotional experience for so many people. So really appreciate this. I guarantee you there's gonna be a lot of people listening to this who go, holy crap, I want to get more of Teresa and hear more of her stuff. So what is the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Contact by email, Teresa at iqeqtq.com, or my website is www.iqeqtq.com. And you can certainly follow me on LinkedIn. If you Google my YouTube page, it's just Teresa Quinlan, and I have 300 plus video snippets about emotional intelligence posted there.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure.